Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and I'd like to talk to you today about Plato and some of his teachings on life. In particular, this lecture is going to focus on some of his work from the text Republic with regard to the questions of what is justice and is a just or moral person any happier than an unjust person. Okay, but let me set the stage for that. Back up just a little bit. In my last lecture, I developed some historical context for the Golden Age of Athens and the emergence of the tradition through the figure of Socrates. And Plato was about 27, 28 years old in 399 BC, 399 BCE, 399 before zero, when Socrates was executed. Plato was present, we think, at his trial, although we have reason to believe he was absent at his execution, despite the famous French painter Jacques-Louis David famously depicting Plato as present at the execution in his later painting on that topic of the execution by Hemlock of Socrates. I think called just The Death of Socrates. Beautiful, though, painting. So I want to talk to you today about how Plato, this mature young man of means from Athens, at 27, 28 years old, is impacted by the death and the loss of his, let me call him mentor, Socrates. It would appear that Plato was pretty devastated, to say the least, by the loss of Socrates, and particularly by the way in which all unfolded, right? Plato's from an old Athenian family with very deep connections to the history of Athens. And so, Plato's very much an Athens guy, and the coolest person he's ever met in Athens is Socrates. And so here's Athens, Athenian democracy and Athenian, court systems and the Athenian demos, the Athenian people, literally behind the death of the person that Plato admired the most in Athens. And so he's pretty devastated by this, it would seem, and probably spends the next decade or more traveling around the Mediterranean, a little lost, seeking, thinking, visiting other places and other areas, but eventually comes back, we think, to Athens in around 387 BCE. And, what unfolds there is the beginning of the Platonic school that comes to be known as the Academy. And the Academy will be the first of the four great schools of antiquity, as they're often known. The four great schools of the ancient period, all in Athens, all within about a century of one another. These schools were the most important sites for the development of the most important philosophical traditions to come out of ancient Athens. Platonic philosophy at the Academy, Aristotelian philosophy at the Lyceum, Epicurean hedonism at the Garden, and Stoic philosophy at the Stoa. We're going to talk about in this course the ideas of 3 out of 4 of those. All of them are awesome and all of them are worth looking at. But today, again, I'm going to focus on Plato and just one of Plato's major writings, but I'm developing for you a little context by talking to you about his formation of the Academy. We think in about 387 before zero. And so, I want to talk a little bit about what the Academy was and what it has come to represent. In some sense, this is the way I think of it in my mind, that Plato comes back to Athens after his sort of long 12-year walkabout, having been crushed by the loss of Socrates, and says, in some sense, okay, we're not going to let this go. We're going to do this. We're going to live examined lives, and we're going to dedicate ourselves to this legacy and to this challenge that Socrates has left for us. But we're not going to do it at the agora. We're not going to do it in the public marketplace. We're not going to do this at the heart of social, political, and economic power. We're going to remove ourselves from that threat that danger and from that distraction. And we're going to create a kind of a zone, let's call it a safe zone, within which we are free to ask the most difficult and probing and challenging questions we can ask. And in community, we can try to find some answers to those questions. And so this is what the academy becomes. And, for, off and on, for over 900 years in different locations around the Mediterranean, off and on, the academy will survive as an institution until I think around 526 or so in the Common Era, the 6th century in the Common Era. I believe the Byzantine Emperor Justinian will finally close all the pagan schools and end the long run of the academy. Good news there is that those remnants of Greek philosophy in the 6th century will find a new home in the Middle East for a while, and then eventually sort of be rediscovered in what's called the late Middle Ages, and that'll in some ways set the stage for the Renaissance and rebirth of ancient philosophy. But we're going to get to that story a little bit later in the lecture series. For now, what I'm describing for you is the long and influential run of the academy that is begun by Plato. And I'm describing an institution that is the first of its kind, right? I mean, whereas the sophists were the first professional intellectuals, the academy is going to be the first school sort of location that you go to, not to learn a trade, but where you just go to think about the deepest questions of existence. And in the coming decades, roughly for the next, I think, 40 years, the last 40 years of his life, from about the age of 40 to the age of 80 when Plato dies, he will teach and learn and listen and sort of run as the leader of the academy. He will do his thing philosophically in what is going to become an amazing collection of some of the top creative and philosophical minds of the Mediterranean. I mentioned in my last lecture that after the Peloponnesian War, Athens is going to lose its status economically and militarily. It's certainly going to be diminished, but culturally and especially intellectually, it's almost as if it will be enhanced by that loss of focus on the political and the economic and the military. And the academy in some ways is part of my argument for that. Many people talk about the legacy of the ancient Greeks in Western civilization. And, of course, no one person and no one institution and no one city-state, right, can take total credit for, the roots of Western civilization. It's always more complex than that. However, I think it is meaningful to talk about some of these little symbolic moments in history, some of these little places and these certain persons that played kind of a key role in bringing some things together. And the academy in ancient Athens, for me, is one of these that's really kind of important to understand. Because this first ever academic institution, right? And we very much get our whole legacy of academia from this moment, right? Of the academy. This becomes the impetus for the later reborn collections of scholars into one body, into universe, into the university systems that will emerge in the late Middle Ages and Western civilization. This is the moment, in some sense, where this is formalized. And I think in some ways that leaves us with a kind of a question for our lives today. Many of us are seeking to sort of better our lives and further ourselves and our thinking within academic contexts. And of course, there are many ways to better ourselves intellectually in less formal settings outside of academia. I'm not pretending academia is the only place for this, but it is kind of a special institution for this, right? And there is a current debate, and I would call it a debate about philosophy of education in some sense, about what today should be the role of the academy, of academia, of higher education in society today. And, you know, to give you kind of a simple version of this debate that I think in some ways is very much related to this moment where Plato begins the academy in ancient Athens, you know, one answer put forth by many people who often hold the purse strings with regards to funding the institutions is that the institutions of higher learning and the remnants of the academy and academia are to be places that should you know, train people to take their place in the economy and do research that, you know, serves some economic interest and, you know, maybe ultimately more charitably, some sort of societal interest. But primarily, especially institutions of undergraduate learning, that particular version of the academy or academia, you know, is often thought of as a place where we train people to take their place in the economy. Contrast that notion with this beginning of the academic tradition, where the academy is not at all about training you to take your place in the economy. The academy is where you go to challenge all your most fundamental assumptions on what makes life worthwhile, including ultimately what makes the economy worthwhile and what makes the political structures that we live by worthwhile. So, you know, I think that in some ways, the formation of the academy by Plato lays down a challenge for all of us who would, you know, whether virtually via means like this, or in ground classes all over the country, you know, when we go to academia, especially as undergraduates, you know, what should be our goal? And of course, there's nothing wrong with going for a degree so that we can have a better chance at the kind of career that we want. But I also think it would be remiss of us to ignore the possibility that the goal of undergraduate education, in some sense, tied to the beginning of the academy by Plato in ancient Athens, is to give us the opportunity to become generally educated and generally thoughtful about many different areas of human thought, including the sciences with regard to the nature of reality and the nature of ourselves, that legacy that comes right out of, you know, philosophical metaphysics. And also the humanities, you know, what is our relationship to art and all the manifestations and artifacts of culture that in some ways are, you know, representative of the human search for meaning and value in life themselves, right? You know, why do we go to the academy? Why do we go to institutions of higher learning? Of course, in part, I think the answer is, you know, to develop essential skills that will make us viable and adaptive within, you know, quickly adapting and evolving economic and political and social structures. But I am really, really a fan of tying this all back to this Platonic quest for wisdom about being alive, right? That in some sense, the general education programs and the undergraduate programs of academia in some sense are about opening ourselves up to the breadth of thought that is possible, to hopefully spark a fire in us to realize that the life of the mind for the human being is in some ways that which would enrich our existence and enrich our societies as a result of our individual lives having been turned on this way. You know, and that's in some sense the legacy of the Platonic Academy, because it carries forward the challenge that Socrates gave, which was to live and examine life and to forego, you know, any kind of thought that ignorance is bliss. The other thing I'd point out about the academy, right, is that the academy is a community of scholars. It's a community of thinkers. And in some sense, I want to connect that to the search for wisdom about life. And in the West, we use the word philosophy, right? Philosophia or philia sophia. I've referred to this already in earlier lectures as kind of a friendship love in pursuit of wisdom. And I really want to sort of emphasize a particular interpretation of that. And that is a kind of a loving, respectful, charitable relationship between peers in the search for wisdom about life. Because in some ways, the academy to me represents something very, very crucial about existence, especially in terms of pursuing wisdom about existence. We, as individuals, have to stop and reflect. And as I argued, maybe in my earlier lecture on Taoism, maybe we need to stop and simply be every once in a while, right? And get our feet back in the territory, right? But we also need to stop and reflect, give ourselves time to think. And then where that becomes very powerful is where we engage with others through writing and through conversation who are doing something similar. And we try together in a community to generate a wisdom for the moment, a wisdom about what it means to be a human in a certain moment of history. What I would now want to refer to from here on out as a kind of a generate a philia sophia community, right? And all of that, I think, comes out of a kind of an exploration of the beginning of the tradition of the academy as begun by Plato, we think in 387 before zero in ancient Athens. Now, at the academy, Plato is going to mature and develop as a thinker, and he's going to begin his career as a writer and as the first major writer in the Western philosophical tradition. And he will write on almost any conceivable topic. Certainly all the big questions in many ways are going to get laid out in the writings of Plato. And later when we talk about how Aristotle shows up at the academy as a student and spends 20 years there, in debate with Plato, especially in that great debate, depicted marvelously in the Renaissance painting of Raphael and the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican. The Plato, the School of Athens, right, which at its center has these two figures, Plato pointing up, and I'm going to try to give you in this lecture series a sense for that gesture, and Aristotle right next to him in debate with him, sort of having his hand in this gesture of pointing down or holding things down. And I'll, again, in my later lecture on Aristotle, I'll try to develop a sense for that. Many, many great scholars of the Western philosophical tradition, and frankly, Western intellectual history at large, would say that Plato lays out the territory for deep thinking, and that, and that especially the debate then that occurs and follows between Plato and his greatest student, Aristotle, in many ways lays out some of the debates that really to this moment, I think, shape or symbolically represent a lot of the viable positions worth considering as you and I try to find our way humbly and charitably towards some wisdom about being a human in this moment and being a good person in this moment. And so Plato matures in his thinking at the academy and becomes the first major writer. Now, there are people who are certainly much greater scholars of Plato than I, and so I'm pulling a lot from their analyses of his writings, and his writings are often broken up into sort of early, middle, and late, and I want to give you some sense for the writings and some sense, particularly for the difference between the early period writings and the middle period writings as he matures as a thinker, before we dig in on one particular writing today in this lecture and one particular set of questions and a few different answers to those two questions. So first thing generally about Platonic writing, it is always in the form of what have come to be known as dialogues. Okay, so Plato, without much attention to scenery or location, sets up his writings by the development of characters who he puts into into conversation with one another. So Plato develops characters, and then he puts those characters into conversation with one another. And he almost always, by the way, almost always has Socrates as one of the main characters in these dialogues. A couple things about this. One, just the format. You know, in my earlier lecture on Taoism, I talked about, hey, we need to think a little bit about the choice of poetry in the Tao Te Ching versus prose. We need to think a little bit about the obscurity of the poetry and the paradoxical nature of the poetry. And here, with regard to Plato, I think we need to think a little bit about this choice of going to dialogues for Plato. And one of the ways that I read that is as a nod to the Philia Sophia notion that I had developed for you with regard to the academy. In some sense, Plato realizes that thought develops best through some kind of dialectical process by which we have a position and a critique of that position and then another position advanced. And so in some sense, even the mode of expression of his writing in this dialogue format is a nod to a part of what I think is crucial in the philosophical process for any of us, and that is that we engage with others. Of course, by ourselves, if we're practiced at this, we can get good at putting forth a position and then finding ways to critique our own position. That's doable within the individual, you know, but it's harder, and things get, I think, exponentially more interesting when we have multiple, engaged and thoughtful minds on these questions and positions. And so Plato's writings, in some sense, reflect that. Furthermore, let me talk a little bit about the choice to have Socrates as a character, and this is going to lead us to my other thing that I wanted to explore about his writings, some differentiation for you between the early and middle period writings. Socrates almost always shows up, and in the in the early period writings of Plato, Socrates is sort of doing what we think of as Socrates' thing, which is he is asking questions of people who are developing positions, and he is slowly dismantling those positions with his questions. And the Platonic, these are often called the Socratic dialogues of Plato. These early dialogues of Plato always end with a kind of, oh, well, I guess you don't understand that as well, and as you thought, and you're welcome, right? That sort of quasi-annoying Socratic tendency to see what he was doing as a kind of a favor to you. Let me dismantle your views for you and show you the weaknesses, and you're welcome. But those dialogues end with no answer to the questions. And they seem to very rarely, if ever, involve Socrates putting forth any kind of positive, what we call positive doctrine, any kind of position for himself. However, this is what the scholars of Platonic writing have used as the mark of the delineating mark between the early period writings and the middle period writings. The difference, if I put it very simply, is that Socrates starts answering the questions that are being considered within the writing. And the interpretation of that is not that, so many years after the death of Socrates, Plato is putting forth Socratic positions. The interpretation there is that Plato is maturing into the development of his own positions, right? And he is still paying homage to Socrates by letting the character Socrates represent the Platonic position. So keep that in mind, that we've talked in this lecture series about Socrates and what we think we know about Socrates, the historical figure, and certainly what Socrates as a historical figure has come to represent in the tradition as a kind of a symbol, as a kind of a martyr. But now we've kind of got a third Socrates here, and that is the character of the middle and late writings of Plato, which we should take, I think the best way to take it is as the character representing the views of Plato. And that'll certainly be the case as we dig in now on one of the middle period writings, arguably the most famous of the middle period writings, and maybe the most famous of all of Plato's writings, the work called Republic. So this lecture now is going to focus on some of the ethical views of Plato's that come out in Republic. And actually it's going to do a little bit more than that. It's going to consider three kind of major views that come out in the Republic via three different characters. Glaucon, a guy that is, we think, Plato's brother and was Plato's brother in real life, who will offer us what is often thought of as the received account. That is maybe sort of an account that you might have heard if you had been attending the right kind of dinner parties, right? The right kind of gatherings. This was an idea that had been floating around apparently in ancient Greece. Put a pin in that because we're gonna end up, making some further important points in the history of ethics with the position that comes out of the character Glaucon. Also the character Thrasymachus, who again was sort of a pulled from history character, like all these major characters were. Thrasymachus, we believe, was a real life sophist. We're not sure that he was quite the jerk that Plato made him out to be in the Republic, but he's going to be, he's going to offer us a really, I think, intriguing, kind of dark and cynical position with regard to justice and morality. And what makes us happy in life that we're going to consider. And then lastly, we'll consider the views that are put into the mouth of the character Socrates, which we should understand as Plato's views. Okay, so let's talk about this book again, sort of, not judging a book by its cover, but starting at the cover, starting at the title. So I would ask my, students in my ground classes and my live classes, synchronous classes, when you hear the title Republic, what do you think this book is about? And when people, reflect on that title, many people quickly come to, well, it's about politics. Okay, well, yes and no. Let me offer you a slightly, maybe carefully worded answer. It's about political philosophy. It's about a search for wisdom with regard to political structures. Not quite the same thing as about politics, right? And in some sense, that's absolutely right. This work, Republic, is a work which puts forth a vision of an ideal society, which is, both a troubling vision in some ways and a fascinating vision in other ways. I may, pursue that tangent at moments in this lecture, but that's not going to be my primary focus. Yes, the book is about political philosophy. But one thing that makes this such a famous writing of Plato's is that it is a book that really addresses all of the major areas of philosophy, at least many of the main areas of philosophy, if I say that a little bit more carefully. It's going to be a book that puts forth a vision of Platonic metaphysics, Plato's developing vision of the nature of reality, very much tied to Platonic epistemology, his theory about knowledge and truth and how we might arrive at truth and why it is possible for us, if we're careful in how we pursue it, to arrive at something called knowledge about something called truth. So it's a book that contains Platonic metaphysics and Platonic epistemology. It has a kind of an aesthetic theory, or it's certainly a philosophy of art and its place in society, one I'm not all that fond of, frankly, but it's in there. It also contains political philosophy, right? As I've mentioned already. And in some ways that is the main goal of the book. But it also contains ethical philosophy. And I'm going to follow a number of other Platonic and Greek philosophy scholars who are going to argue that this is one fair rendering of Republic, that while on its surface it's about political philosophy, in some ways at its heart, it's about ethical philosophy. And here's the way that I think about that and the relationship. And this is also sort of not only a valuable point about Republic, but this is also a valuable point about philosophy, or at least a valuable point that raises some questions about philosophy itself that are worth wrestling with if you're interested in pursuing a more philosophically awakened life. Yes, this is a work about political philosophy, but you have to ask yourself the question as to why would we try to spend a lot of effort and time thinking through, seeking wisdom about political structures. In some sense, it seems like a silly question, but but actually, ask yourself, why do you live within the political structures that you live in? In some sense, the answer for many of us, right, if we're honest, is, well, this was just where I was born. It's like the number one predictor of your religious faith. The answer is geography, and just sort of the chance, the sort of luck of the draw, sort of the where you were born, is the best predictor of the political institutions that you adhere to and live under, and in some sense sort of take maybe for granted, is where I'm going with that. And not to sound too dismissive, that is, I think, also the number one predictor of your value structure as well, generally, in terms of what we're exploring here in ethics, and even number one predictor of your religious faith. For most people, as I argued in my earlier lecture on the evolution of philosophy, Homo sapiens have these amazing capacities for thought, but what do we do with it? Well, we solve problems and we make tools and we're very, very clever. But mostly, I would argue, ironically, what we do with our capacity for abstract thought to sort of be able to think beyond the sensory present is we store a conditioning and a programming called culture that gives us an interpretive lens for living our reality. And if we're honest, most of us never become philosophically awakened about that. This is a very recent way of being a human, and it's still a very rare way of being a human, right? As I argued in that same lecture. And so we arrive at these things very passively, right? And if we're going to become a little bit more conscious about them all, then we need to realize that we want to pursue a wisdom about these things. And so most of us have never asked the question of why do we live within the political structures that we live in? And one very simple answer is that we live within certain political structures in order to have better lives. Once we get past the answer of I was born here, which, that's descriptively true, but it's not a very good answer, right? Like, why do I want to continue to support the political structures that I was born into? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I need to think about them. Well, how am I going to think about them? Well, I need to think about the goal. And to put it somewhat simply, I would argue that the goal of the political structures that we choose to put in place in any moment in history should be the promotion of a good life. What else? In some sense, it's about basic security, but it usually almost always goes beyond basic security to some vision of flourishing, to some vision of a good life. And that leads political philosophy, right, back to, in some sense, ethics. That leads that question of why live in a certain set of political institutions, what's going to constitute wisdom in political philosophy, leads us back to, in some sense, a kind of a intellectually prior question. And that is, well, if what I'm seeking in my political institutions is a good life, then I need to get back to this ethical question, certainly this ancient ethical question of what is a good life. And in this way, many people have interpreted the Republic, Plato's Republic, as a book that centers on questions of ethics, both in terms of, how shall we think about a good life? And I think we'll see in the answers that we explore, also in terms of, where do the value structures, including the moral value structures of society, come from, and how should they be generated? Now, so I made the case that Republic is, on the surface of it, a book about political philosophy, but of course it's very famous because it contains a lot of different types of philosophy. And maybe one way to interpret this book is to see that at its core, it's a book that tries to deal with the questions of ethics first and foremost. Now, I actually, in some sense, I'm going to proceed accordingly. But I think you're going to see, particularly in my answers, particularly in my interpretation of the answers of the character Socrates, the Platonic answers, that the question of ethics, particularly this ancient ethical question of what is a good life, leads back to an even deeper question. And those are the questions of metaphysics. And, here's how the line of questioning maybe goes back deeper and deeper to the most fundamental questions. How shall we structure society? Well, I don't know. What are we aiming at? Well, we're aiming at some vision of flourishing. We're aiming at some vision of a good life. Okay. Well, what's a good life? Okay. Well, in order to answer that question of what is a good life, maybe I need a thoughtful answer to the question of what is life. And so this is how I think political philosophy can be thought of as grounded in ethics, and ethical philosophy can be grounded in metaphysics. And metaphysics, generally, this sort of area of philosophy that deals with, what is the nature of reality, remember, importantly, is going to break that up typically in its answers into two kinds of sets of answers. In response to two questions. What is the nature of reality gets divided up into the question of who are we, what kind of creature are we, and what is this world like? And then that sets up the ability to say, okay, how does a creature like me navigate a reality like this? And those, what I'm calling metaphysical answers, those metaphysical positions are going to give you a sense of how does a creature like me navigate a reality like this well, which is going to flesh out your theory of flourishing or your theory of the good life, which would then inform what kind of political structures we want to build in order to foster the greatest chance we can create for us to live out that good life. And so, not only am I sort of unpacking layers here within Republic, I'm also doing this in part to suggest to you that this is one vision of a path of philosophical maturation for each one of us. Philosophical growth, in some sense, means, taking on the initial Socratic challenge of realizing we don't have it all figured out yet, and then realizing that we need to maybe know ourselves a little bit more deeply. And one way to talk about that is to, know what kind of creature we are, but more specifically, maybe know what we think so far, and then sort of get these views out onto the table, perhaps in a Philia Sophia, a community of seekers, and then to have the guts, the psychological and emotional strength to critique our own assumptions. And remember, the connection back to my lecture on Taoism and mysticism in general is that if you never understand what it means to develop a deeper sense of yourself than what you think currently, if you're the kind of Homo sapien that is always sort of carried away in thought, then what that suggests very strongly to me is that your sense of yourself, your identity, is tied to what you think and what you believe in this moment, which is going to make philosophy very difficult for you, right? Because as we try to critique your innermost assumptions about existence, you're going to feel threatened by that. And it's very normal for all of us to go through that process. Maybe part of the solution to that typical psychological and emotional hurdle to philosophical growth is that we learn to have a sense of ourselves that isn't so completely identified with our thoughts, by learning what it means from the mystical meditative traditions, today often thought of as the mindfulness-based traditions, that you and I don't have to be unconsciously, irrationally committed to our thoughts. That maybe changing your mind over the course of your life is actually just growth. And that if you were to develop some practice in your life where you readily began to witness your thoughts rather than to be sort of caught up in them unconsciously, that process would come a little bit more readily to you. So that's, I wanted to, what we're doing here, right, in this lecture series and in this course as a whole is trying to build kind of a vision of how we might set ourselves up to respond most effectively to these age-old human questions of how can I live a good life and how can I be a good person? How can we do that at best in this moment? And I'm going to suggest to you, right, that we do that best by standing on the shoulders of giants and learning the many lessons that they have to offer us. Let's not reinvent the wheel here. Let's not start from scratch here, right? And so I've tried to just now, take the interrelatedness of the different areas of philosophy that we find in Plato's Republic and tie that back to some of the points that I was making in earlier lectures here. But now I want to proceed by developing for you a kind of an interpretation of some of the main points that come out of the Platonic work Republic with regard to two central and related ethical questions. And the first question is often characterized as, what is justice? Now, again, I don't speak or read Greek, and so that puts me at a disadvantage here. And I, like many of us, maybe have to rely upon other people who have created these incredible translations of Republic from the Greek. But what I have learned from scholars of the Greek is that the notion of justice within Greek and within Greek society was not as narrow perhaps as our notion of justice today. Now, particularly here, I'm referring to our contemporary notion of retributive justice, or justice within the justice system. We have a broader sense for justice today, which is kind of a justice as fairness. I think that maybe gets us more in the direction that we should go here in order to understand the first major question, ethical question of Republic, which is, what is the nature of justice? Right now, I'm sort of unpacking that question, right, just to make sure we're clear on what the question is. And what I'm suggesting to you is that the Greek notion of justice itself is probably broader than what you are bringing to the table in terms of your own assumptions about justice. So be careful of that. A lot of times as we try to stand on the shoulders of giants, or even as we try to communicate with other people about life and pursue a wisdom about life in a Philia Sophia, one of the great challenges is not always interpreting the language that they're using by the assumptions that we have in our own mind. We need to be very clear that in some sense we understand how somebody is using an idea. And I think in this context of Republic, the question of what is justice could be fairly understood as a very broad question about the notion of what is goodness in the almost broadest sense of the word. Maybe we could talk about it in terms of ethical goodness itself. And my argument for this would be, again, relying heavily on other scholars that are more entrenched in this tradition than I, is that we can see justice not in the narrow sense of justice as in criminal justice systems or retributive justice, not even more broadly in the sense of distributed justice as sort of fairness, or justice as a sort of a relationship or principle that governs the distribution of goods and services and burdens and benefits of, say, living together in political structures, but justice in the broadest possible sense of ethical goodness. And so in some sense, the question is a big, big theoretical question. What is justice maybe should be understood as what is ethical goodness itself. And in some sense, that is really at the heart of the project of Republic for Plato, is to develop a kind of a mature theory of ethical goodness. And we're going to see this unfold both in terms of his theory of justice, but also there'll be implications later in the next lecture. I'll deal with this in his very, very famous allegory of the cave. There'll be implications for the ethical question of what is a good human life that come out of the allegory of the cave. Okay, so keep that in mind, that the questions of justice here are very, very broad questions. Now, the second question we're going to wrestle with here in this lecture is the just person any happier than the unjust person? Okay, again, let's unpack the question before we get started exploring possible answers to that. Is the person that's concerned with ethical goodness any happier than the person who doesn't really care about ethical goodness or notions of ethical goodness? Is the person who's striving to be ethically good, or we might even say, is the ethically good person any happier than the person who doesn't care about ethical goodness or is not an ethically good person? Okay, I really love the specificity of the second question as it complements the generality of the big first theoretical question. The first question, right, is what is justice? What is ethical goodness? But the second question sort of really makes this very human by saying, okay, you know, here's a theory of ethical goodness. Do I really want it? And I think that's a very honest question in some ways, because we often, as human beings, you know, if we're honest, right, we talk a good game, maybe we talk a better game than we walk, right? That would be, I think, pretty normal in some sense, right? For example, we have many figures of history that we sort of hold up as ideals of ethical goodness, and yet in some respects, we really don't live like them at all. We champion them and we celebrate them and we live our lives maybe purportedly almost dedicated to them, but we often don't live up to the most difficult parts of what they ask for us. And so I think that there's a kind of an interesting relationship here in this second question of, is the just person happier than the unjust? A relationship of theory and practice, right? You know, what's the relationship between the theoretical answer and what we actually want to do with our lives? Okay, so the basic structure for the remainder of the lecture is to look at the answers of three main characters that I already talked about earlier: Glaucon, Thrasymachus, and Socrates. And I'm going to go in that order, despite the order that they show up in the text, because I think that the answers build in an interesting way by going in that order. The answers of Glaucon and Thrasymachus and Socrates to the two, as I've called them, central ethical questions of Republic. What is justice, and is the just person happier than the unjust? And now I'm going to start by exploring the answers of Glaucon, Plato's real-life brother, who is reportedly giving us what he calls the received account, this maybe idea that would have been, you know, heard of before if you were, you know, hanging out in the right Philia Sophia communities of people. If you were engaged in the right sort of conversations, maybe you heard an answer like this. Okay, I think what you're going to find is that the answers to these questions, particularly, well, all three of them in a way, are provocative because they're surprising, right? Like there's going to be something in terms of a surprising twist to each of these answers. They're not what you're expecting. I think in some sense, in a work dedicated to the big questions of the ideal society and the big questions of what is ethical goodness itself or what is justice, we're expecting some kind of highly idealized utopian vision. But I think what you're going to find, and I'll start here with Glaucon here in a moment, is it's just much more of a sort of a down-to-earth, or at least a very surprising answer from what you might have been expecting. And so I think that the essence of Glaucon's answer to the question of what is justice can be sort of attached to a single word, and that is that it is a compromise. Okay, so justice, or perhaps ethical goodness itself, is a kind of a compromise. And I think what we're going to see here, right, is that there's maybe two senses of compromise here. One is that there is a kind of a middle ground that ethical goodness represents, and justice, I'm going to use this term justice, represents a kind of a middle ground of a life between the best possible situation that we might imagine and the worst possible situation that we might imagine. And the best possible situation, according to Glaucon, that we might imagine is sort of a life of total freedom, where you just sort of get to do whatever you want. And the worst possible life, according to Glaucon, is a life where you are not free in any sense, or not in any meaningful sense, and you don't get to do what you want to do with your life. And so the idea here of justice or ethical goodness as a compromise is that it's somehow a middle ground where we're not totally free to do whatever we want, and yet we're not totally constrained. And this introduces a kind of a second sense, I think, of the word compromise here. And that is that justice or ethical goodness is a compromise that we make with each other. It's kind of an agreement that we make with each other to not do everything we want to do in order to live together in a cooperative arrangement in order to avoid the likelihood of living in the worst possible situation, which is living completely unfree, as dominated or oppressed by the whims of some other creature, perhaps some other human being. So the compromise, right, is this middle ground position that we're going to try to inhabit between the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And it's going to be a middle ground that we're going to inhabit through a compromise, a second meaning of compromise, a compromise we make with each other in order to not do everything we want to do. Because what's going to make this cooperative living possible is a kind of a code of conduct which will come to define good behavior. And so the notion of ethical goodness, it would seem from Glaucon's answer, is that it is a code of conduct limiting freedom that we would readily accept because it keeps us perhaps out of harm's way or less likely to live an existence of no freedom. Because we're going to avoid being somebody's slave or victim or prey more readily by joining together with others into a cooperative kind of security-based endeavor that is only possible through some kind of code of conduct that will limit freedom so that we can live together more safely. And that ethical goodness is going to come out of the code of conduct that is generated by the rules, let's say, required for cooperative living for greater security. Okay, put a pin in this Glauconian answer, because in some sense this was an answer floating around in ancient Greece, but it won't be the Platonic answer, it won't be the Aristotelian answer, it won't be the answer of any of the major schools, the four major schools of philosophy that come out of the Golden Age. It won't be a major answer until Greek philosophy's reborn, renascent, and we get to the modern age. So put a pin in this idea, because we're definitely going to come back to it. And one of the intellectual challenges I'd like for you to sort of wrestle with is, why is this idea that's been around so long an idea that really becomes prominent in the 17th century, to kind of put a time frame on that. You know, in some ways that might be might be obvious by the time we get there, but I'd love for you to just think about that a little bit. So the Glauconian answer, right, is that ethical goodness or justice is a compromise. And why would we give up some of our freedom in order to live in this compromised, if I can use that word, you know, somewhat ironically here, compromised situation in which I'm not as free to do everything I want to do? Well, it's because I am all too painfully aware that if there weren't a code of conduct that made cooperative living possible, then I would be living in a kind of a kill or be killed world in which I am much more likely to end up over here as somebody's prey, somebody's victim, you know, somebody's slave, where I'm totally unfree. And so because I am aware of my vulnerability and my weakness, I am glad to engage in this compromise. And over time, the code of conduct that makes that cooperative living possible will be sort of expanded out into this notion of justice or ethical goodness. Okay, surprising answer, I would say, right off the bat. Now, in terms of the second question, is the just person happier than the unjust? The answer here is given somewhat indirectly by Glaucon, which is an interesting choice. What he does is he offers us an ancient Greek myth that had many different versions. So he gives us kind of one simple version of an ancient Greek myth about a shepherd named Gyges. and the myth is often referred to as the Ring of Gyges myth. So in answer to the second question, is the just person happier than the unjust? Glaucon, the character, gives us the Ring of Gyges story. And here's the version of it. Gyges the shepherd is out, and there's I'm going to give you a simple version of it, where there's a gigantic storm and the earth kind of opens up and a tomb is kind of exposed, and Glaucon finds what I believe to be a totally naked guy on a horse, which would be bizarre enough. But this guy's not completely naked. He's got a ring, and Glaucon takes the ring, and he's not quite sure what to do with it. And so he's kind of keeping it to himself, but he's got it on and he's playing with it. And at some point, people start to talk about him as if he's not even there. And he comes to realize, in short, that it isn't yet another version of the mythological motif of the Ring of Power, right? Recognizable from the Lord of the Rings universes, right, in Tolkien's writings. But more specifically, this ring is a ring of invisibility. And so what does Glaucon eventually do with the ring that grants him invisibility? Does he go off and do the great moral deeds to make the world a better place? Well, what Glaucon does is he somehow, with invisibility, seduces the queen. That's not clear, but it's a myth, so don't worry about that. And he seduces the queen, and he assassinates the king, and he takes power, long and short, right? And so this myth is allegorical, right? We're supposed to read it at the deeper level. How does this myth become an argument for a position with regard to the second question of, is the just person happier than the unjust? Well, in some sense, the story seems to be saying, well, if we could choose, then maybe like Glaucon, because maybe like Gyges, Glaucon says explicitly, give the ring to a rogue, give the ring to a very ethically good person, and over enough time, what you're going to find is that goodness, which in some ways, to use the language of an earlier lecture, is a cultural construction, a social construction that is sort of programmed, indoctrinated, enculturated, conditioned into us as we raise. If you take away the consequences of being judged or punished for your actions through something like invisibility or just the power to get away with whatever you want, what's going to be the result? Well, the implication is that the conscience that we think we have morally and ethically, that which guides us, is going to fade like an echo. And that eventually what we would do is sort of resort to doing whatever we want to do. Now, this presents in some sense a kind of a theory of us. This presents a kind of a theory of our moral nature, namely that we don't have one. I think that's highly debatable. In fact, we will in the lecture series get to that and consider that in depth in later lectures. I'll just say for now that I think in some ways, I'm going to make this sound very plausible here in a second, but I want you to sort of mark this as a question. This is a really important question about who are we? In order to do ethics, I argued earlier, we need to do metaphysics. In order to do metaphysics, we really want to think about who are we, which, by the way, is going to blossom eventually into social science. And then what is reality, which eventually is going to blossom into science. And so you want your ethical philosophies, I would argue, sort of grounded in your best social science and your best science and physical science. And I think actually what we're hearing more and more from the social scientists and from biologists is that, this idea that we have no inherent moral nature is way too simple. However, let me, put it to you in a way that's pretty tempting, if only so that you can be a little bit more likely to not be maybe tempted in an overly simple way by this line of thought. Let's take the Ring of Gyges myth here and see it for what it's intended to be, which is kind of an argument for a position that no, justice isn't what makes us happier. Injustice, understood as sort of not being constrained by a code of conduct that limits our freedom, injustice is what makes us happier, right? And we're supposed to take the Ring of Gaiji's story really and kind of honestly ask ourselves the question, if you, right, could get away with anything and nobody had to know, nobody would judge you, and there'd never be any consequences, would you act the way you act now? I think most of us are honest enough to say, you know, in some sense, no. I certainly hope I wouldn't engage in the rapey, murderous actions of Glaucon. You know, that's fair. I'm hoping that maybe you're thinking that. But even if your answer is a kind of a, well, I wouldn't act the same way I act now, I wouldn't pursue the same goals I pursue now, maybe they would change over time, and I wouldn't certainly adhere to the same codes of conduct restricting my freedom that I adhere to now, well, then that's the force of the argument that's being offered. And it's designed to get us to see that in some sense, it's not following, you know, ethical norms that is what makes us most happy. It's freedom to pursue our desires that make us most happy. Now, I want to make a small point that I think is relevant to life in general, and that we're going to come back to certainly here in a moment and later again in the term, I'm sure, in the lecture series. And that is that, you know, what's really implied by the Gaiji story also, right, is that the ring is a ring of power. In this case, it's a ring of invisibility and hence of freedom from consequences. But the notion here that's also very tempting, right, is that power has a corrupting influence on what we think of as our ethical norms. And that generally is pretty tempting in a way. Even though I would argue that it's overly simple to say that, you know, we have no sort of nature-based innate tendencies towards what we would think of as ethical and moral norms, at the same time, I think it is right to recognize and to add to the discussion that the more power you get, sometimes the harder it is to adhere to the same kind of norms that we would adhere to if we didn't have freedom from prosecution, freedom from judgment, if we had the freedom to hide our actions from the world. And in some sense, we could make a simple appeal to even American political philosophy, you know, the very notion of the separation of powers. And checks and balances. While it is really in some ways not fun to watch the separate powers, you know, argue and get so little done sometimes, you know, why do we do that? Well, you know, one simple answer to why separate powers and why to have checks and balances, right, is that because we know that that famous political saying, I think attributed to Lord Acton, you know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Too much concentrated power does something that we don't want to see to the human character in relation to its goals, its values, and its ethical norms. And in some sense, the Gaiji story speaks to that. And in some sense, then, that's supposed to be persuasive that it is not justice that makes us happy, but it's freedom from codes of conduct that restrain freedom that make us happy. Okay, so there's the first answer, the first set of answers from the character Glaucon. And now I'd like to proceed to the answers offered by the character Thrasymachus. Okay, Thrasymachus, you know, is kind of being portrayed by Plato in this discussion as like, how did he get invited to the party? Because he's kind of a jerk, he's kind of maybe sighing, imagining rolling his eyes, kind of laughing at the answers being offered. And as people try to get him involved in the conversation, he seems to be arrogant and withholding and like, you wouldn't understand, you can't handle, you know, my answers, and you can't afford my answers. But eventually he seems to get goaded into offering a position. And the position that Thrasymachus takes, if I say it very simply and then I unpack it, is that, you know, any notion of justice or ethical goodness, you know, don't kid yourself, is always that which serves the interests of the strongest parties in society. And the answer seems to be basically saying this, like, look, don't be naive, okay? The value structures of society are determined by the most influential people in society. They're the people who have the most economic, political, and social power in society. And, if you believe that, these value structures are meant to protect you or to promote good living for the most number of people possible, or supposed to help the individual develop itself to its fullest potential, then you're just blind to the reality of the fact that, look, in hunting and gathering scenarios, humans were middle of the food web, and it was a kill or be killed reality, and family tribes bound together, and occasionally made peace treaties with other related tribes. But all that was really about security. And as we moved from hunting and gathering, and this is me embellishing upon the Thrasymachine answer, into more complex societies, it's still, Thrasymachus is implying, kill or be killed. It's just a different game. And in these complex societies, having to literally violently suppress the interests of others that compete with your own is bad for business. In complex societies, the name of the game is having a powerful enough military, enough economic strength to have a powerful enough military strength to be able to resist coercion on the part of other cultures, and maybe even to impose your will upon other cultures. And the best way to do that is to control the value structure of society. Justice is always in the interest of the strongest parts of society, in order that they may control the behavior of the vast majority of society, in order to further entrench their positions of power and perhaps expand them, right? Don't be fools, right? I mean, consider, now his answer to the second question: is the just person happier than the unjust? One can imagine Thrasymachus rolling his eyes at this question in light of his first answer. It's like, well, I guess in some sense, if you would rather just remain a sheeple rather than take your place amongst the truly strong who are imposing their will on existence, sheeple want to live within the comfortable blanket of these ethical norms. But anybody with eyes open enough are going to recognize that value structures of society serve the interests of the strongest, and that the name of the game is to be able to define the value structures for anybody else, so that ultimately maybe you are the one in charge of a society and of an economy, and you are guiding it according to what is in your interest and the interest of your own family and your own, small sort of tribal group, your inner circle, right? So that you can guard yourself and so that you can live the best possible existence. Don't be a fool. Justice doesn't make us happiest. Thrasymachus says, justice makes us pawns in somebody else's game. Ethical goodness makes us, it makes us the sheep, and the real game is being played by the wolves. And, again, it's kind of like there's a great movie line, I think, from A Few Good Men, which says, you can't handle the truth. In some sense, Thrasymachus is saying most people really can't handle that in some sense, justice is an illusion serving the interests of the strong, because they don't have the spine. They don't have the kind of ruthlessness and strength that it takes to really compete. They're more comfortable living within the sort of confines of the lie of ethical goodness, within the relative safety of some particular culture or society. But don't be a fool, Thrasymachus says. Injustice is what prospers. I mean, you don't go into a kill or be killed fight adhering to some rules about eye gouging and groin strikes. I mean, in a fight that is to the death, you do whatever it takes, or you are the fool. And just because we have this thin veneer of civilization over us now don't be fooled into thinking that life isn't still kill or be killed. Okay, now the Thrasymacheian position is, I would argue, on the one hand, upsetting. It implies, again, a kind of a answer that is similar to Glaucon's about our moral nature, that, i.e., that we have no inherent moral nature. I think we can argue with that, and we will. But again, let's give each position its due. The Thrasymacheian answer is from 2,400 years ago, really frighteningly easy to extract and to interpolate into even the context of late-stage capitalist democratic American society. Do we think that the value structures of American society benefit the people with the most, particularly economic power? I don't think that is conspiratorial to say out loud. I think that in some respects that's just borne out by a kind of a informed analysis of how capitalism in conjunction with liberal political philosophies emerging in the modern age have played out. Now, I actually think it's a little bit more interesting to give both the Glauconian and the Thrasymacheian positions their due, and say that if you take them together, they're kind of an interesting hermeneutic structure or interpretive lens through which you could look at the history of particularly liberal political societies in the last few hundred years. That in some sense, the value systems that get promoted within, let's talk about, capitalist democratic societies over the last few hundred years are some kind of blend / wrestling match between the interests of the many for safety and flourishing and the interests of the few in terms of their own interests as they compete with the interests of others from other societies. That, in some ways, sounds descriptively, well, it doesn't sound like crazy talk, I'll put it that way. Okay, now that leads to our consideration of the third set of answers from the character Socrates. And here I'm going to talk about Socrates, but just keep in mind, right, like this is the Platonic answer through the character Socrates. And one of the things I love about the Socratic answer here is what a turn it is, right? Like the way in which he completely sort of reverses the conversation in order to again take us by surprise when offering us an answer to the question of what is justice or what is ethical goodness, and does it make a person happier than injustice or, say, lack of concern with ethical goodness. Okay, so the Socratic answer, again, is somewhat indirect. It'll take a moment to develop it, but here's the way that the answer builds. Socrates, the character, says, well, okay, I'll tell you, but what I've got to do in order to tell you is I need to take a step back and I need to talk to you a little bit about our own nature. Here is, I think, very much on the surface of it, that move that drops back from the ethical question of what is goodness in life to the metaphysical question, specifically the version of the metaphysical question about the nature of reality and what kind of creature are we. And Plato, through Socrates, offers us what has come to be known as the tripartite theory of the psyche. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Tripartite just meaning three-part. And psyche, as a Greek word, often translated as soul. That's perhaps a little unfortunate as a translation because, again, it's going to be hard for many of us to sort of get our own assumptions about the word soul, our own sort of metaphysical baggage and assumptions out of the way in order to better understand what Plato's trying to get at here. So keep in mind that while this is commonly translated as soul, maybe it's better translated as life force or, sort of that which animates us. Right? Maybe it is that sort of whatever that great mystery is that animates the human being, right? And so this is the three-part theory of that which gives life to a human being. And I just want to put, ask you to put a little intellectual pin in this very notion of a three-part theory of the human being. Aristotle, who's very much going to disagree with Plato on many, many points of philosophy, including this one, is still going to agree with the idea of a three-part theory. And then we're going to see in the modern era that this will be echoed by great thinkers like Sigmund Freud. And I wouldn't spend too much time trying to see how they're all saying the same thing. I don't think they are. But the theme here that I'm trying to draw your attention to is that a lot of these great thinkers of history, very influential thinkers of history, when they have developed a theory of us, have developed, this based on the idea that you're not simple. You're not a one thing, you're kind of a complexity. And that if you know thyself, you're going to, in part, become a student of your own complexity. I think that's actually a really important theme in ethics here. And the other thing I'm going to point out, right, is that it's no accident that this is a theory of the psyche and it's a theory of us, and that what's going to happen when this kind of Greek philosophy gets reborn and renascent and gives, expanded into the Enlightenment and gives rise to science, that this literally will be connected to sort of the birth of that tradition that I just referenced indirectly by bringing out Freud, which is the tradition of psychology, psychology, the study of the psyche. In some sense, I could say it more generally, that the theories of the psyche are going to give rise to, aspects of social science in the modern era. Here we're witnessing, again, another kind of major sort of seminal moment in things coming together within a community, within a place that is a network of many different societies, a crossroad of many different societies, but in this philosophy of Plato, at the nexus of this giant community and crossroads, in some sense, we're witnessing the birth of psychology. And so the theory of the psyche that Socrates, the character, gives us goes like this. In order to understand the human being, which will then inform our answer about goodness, it involves understanding our complexity and more specifically our three sort of tiered self. That which animates us drives us kind of in three general directions. So we have within us what Plato calls the appetites, the spirit, and reason. And these three parts of our psyche or life force drive us in sort of three different directions. I think that's maybe the easiest way to wrap your head around this. And there is, of course, some debate among scholars as to the exact meanings of these elements, but I'm going to give you kind of a simple version of it that'll get the conversation rolling and get your thoughts rolling. And I think also serve as a basis of an interesting set of thoughts and conversations. Let's start very simply with the appetites. These are our drives, our kind of basic instinctual drives. That's the way I interpret it, toward, food and drink and sex, and maybe even safety in some sense, although some people connect that with another element. I'm gonna lump that in with the appetites. That these are sort of the old brain drives of the human as, very much a biological organism. We are driven towards, food, drink, sex, procreation, and comfort. And this is the appetites. We also have within us the spirit. Again, be careful. Make sure you get your own assumptions about the word spirit out of the way in order to entertain the Platonic notion of the spirit. For Plato, spirit is perhaps best understood as sort of a love of honor, a love of glory, a love of reputation. It's sort of, I think, associated with caring what other people think of you. Caring about your name, right? Like caring about your reputation. In some sense, this is tied, I think, to ambition, right? It's a sort of cultural ambition and sort of making a name for yourself. And so we're driven on the one hand by appetites, but in our complexity, we're also driven by making a name for ourselves. We're driven by honor and driven by glory and driven by reputation. And those two, as you might see, are very different. They can be at odds, to say the least, right? Our love of food, drink, sex, and comfort might be at odds with our drive towards our love of certain levels of cultural achievement that would lead to our name, our reputation, our honor, and our glory. And so we have appetite, love of food, drink, sex, and comfort, and we have spirit, love of honor and glory and reputation, and we have within us also reason, which is that which drives us towards understanding. I actually want to underline that word for Plato. I think it's significant, and it'll be important maybe in the next lecture if I can remember to bring this back out. But the highest kind of goal in a human life is a kind of an ultimate kind of understanding for Plato, and that comes out in his famous allegory of the cave teaching. So we have a part of us, yes, alongside the part that loves food, drink, sex, and comfort, and alongside the part of us that loves honor, glory, reputation, we have a part of us that just loves understanding. We love to comprehend. And what I want to sort of lay out for you, right, is the way in which, even though this isn't contemporary psychology, this isn't crazy talk. This is very, relatable in a way. Imagine you're preparing for an exam and you get a text from somebody that you think is really cute and that has never texted you before. And they're like, hey, why don't you come down and meet me down here for 2-for-1s and, we'll have a good time. And it's like, whoa, okay, there's a part of you that Plato would call your appetites, which have been stirred in a major way by this text. But you're studying for your exam, and think about the glory of an A on your ethics exam, right? Think about, less comically, your desire to be a good student and to be, understood as a good student and as a person who can accomplish things and achieve things in life and do things excellently. And so there's this building tension between the appetites and spirit here. So imagine you go back to your studies, and in your studies, maybe somebody crazy like Dr. Swanson has you looking at something like Homo habilis and trying to figure out how is Neanderthal and Homo habilis tied to the study of ethics, And along the way, doing a little extra research, and you come across, Homo floresiensis or something like that, some other upright walking ape ancestor that was maybe like a dwarf creature, and you're like, what? There were like really dwarfs? And you start to read an article on Homo floresiensis, and all of a sudden you find yourself maybe comprehending the way in which we could put Homo sapiens within the larger evolutionary context in a way that would be really powerful and meaningful, and it's really changing your conception of yourself. And wait a second, this isn't on the test. The spirit jumps back in, snap out of it, reason. You're here you're falling in love with understanding here. Stay focused. We got to get an A on the test, and that's not on the review. And then the phone blows up again. And it's that cute so-and-so down at the 2-for-1 special place. And the appetites kick back in. Okay, so what I'm describing here, right, is foreshadowing where Plato's theory of ethical goodness is going to go here in a second. And that is that know thyself. Remember that phrase. And when you know thyself as the kind of creature you are, you will see you're more complex than you thought. And you will see that if you don't understand your complexity, what your life can be like is a constant struggle between the different drives and elements of yourself. And yet, if you know thyself, through this wisdom, through this understanding, you may come to understand your own complexity and perhaps minimize, mitigate the struggle internally. Okay, there's a little setup there. So the next move of the argument here, as we again try to unpack we've now unpacked the tripartite theory of the psyche. Remember, the goal here was to give the Socratic character Socrates' answer to the question of what is justice. And he said, well, you got to allow me this. I got to develop for you a theory of the psyche. Okay, fine, we've done that. Now the next move is for Socrates, the character, aka Plato, to tie this theory of the psyche to what are known as the 4 cardinal virtues in Greek culture. 4 standard forms of excellence in Greek culture. wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And what he's going to do here is he's going to unpack his interpretation of the best way to understand the four really important excellences that you should cultivate into yourself in order to have the best chance to get to the best life. He's going to unpack these four excellences in terms of his psychological theory, his theory of the psyche and our complexity. So again, I'll give you kind of a simple version of this, but let's start with wisdom. I think this is a little overly simple, but I like to start here. In some sense, wisdom is a virtue or an excellence that you would cultivate in yourself to the extent that you give your capacity for reasoning, to the extent that you give that drive, that part of yourself, reason, as one of the three parts of the psyche, some space in your life, some quality space in your life. Like imagine your life is a set of projects, and the question is, what are you doing with your life projects? Well, part of your life's project should be like understanding life. That's the examined life challenge, right? And you have a chance at developing this wisdom and understanding and this excellence to the extent that you give that drive within yourself an opportunity to thrive and to flourish. You've got to give it time to develop, right? And the sad reality for many of us in the 20th century is that we've been schooled in these institutions that are set up like, you know, like they're designed to make factory workers, right? And they have in some sad way beat out of us our curiosity and beat out of us our love for learning. You know, by getting us up way too early and locking us in for X number of hours into this structure, you know, and, you know, again, I would say maybe underpaying many of the professionals that are responsible for us and, you know, and standardized testing us into, you know, conformity and death. Anyway, we need to rediscover reason within ourselves. I think this is, to me, a pretty meaningful point coming out of Plato. And if you have any chance at the excellence called wisdom, it will be to the extent that you nurture your own, you know, drive, not just what's on the test, not just food, drink, sex. And again, it's not saying that's all wrong, but you have to make a place in your life for the pursuit of understanding. Okay, so you cultivate wisdom by giving reason, in some sense, its due place in your life. Now, the cultivation of courage, Plato is going to argue somewhat strangely, is not about like fearlessness. That's way overly simple, Plato thinks. Courage is about knowing when to let spirit, this sort of drive for ambition and accomplishment and glory, when to give it some leash, right? Because spirit provides a kind of an important drive in our lives. And yet at times, if you're the kind of person who spikes the ball into grandma's face at the family picnic in order to win that game, you know, spirit is out of control here. What you need is the wisdom of a well-developed reason to help I'm not going to use the word temper here, I'm going to save that for temperance, but to help manage spirit. And so in some sense, courage is not fearlessness. Courage is knowing what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of. Courage is knowing what to go for via spirit and what not to go for. And so in some sense, courage is a relationship for Plato between a well-cultivated reason and spirit, which has its important role to play as a driving force within us. Temperance is going to have a very similar, the third of the four cardinal virtues. Temperance is going to have a very similar way of being developed for Plato. Temperance is cultivated as a relationship between wisdom developed by reason and the appetites. Okay, the appetites are an important drive. There's nothing wrong, inherently wrong with being a biological organism that is driven towards sex and is driven towards food and drink and comfort. But clearly, Appetites can get the best of us. If you're the kind of person that steals grandma's TV in order to get some more, opiates, your drive for comfort is out of whack, right? And so what we need is we need a relationship between reason and its capacity to generate wisdom and the appetites. And then the appetites can drive us forward in important and needed ways, but tempered by the wisdom of reason. Okay, so wisdom is the development of reason, to say it very simply. Courage is the relationship between reason and spirit, and temperance is the relationship between reason and appetite. And now we have, it turns out, unpacked this really surprising definition of justice or ethical goodness. Because to the extent that you have wisdom, courage, and temperance, you have justice or ethical goodness within you. And let me say this another way that I think is a little bit more impactful and meaningful, and that is the extent to which you have cultivated through knowing thyself a harmonious relationship between the different elements in your own complexity. That's the extent in which you are good or just. Justice or goodness is an internal state generated through self-understanding. And now, let me go on to make 2 points based on this. One, quickly to kind of answer the second question of, is the just person happier than the unjust? I mean, in some sense, the answer is a very unphilosophical, well, duh, kind of like, well, what do you want? Do you want internal harmony generated by self-understanding? Or do you want a life of internal conflict generated through ignorance of self? What's your best chance at enjoying and getting the most out of your existence? Is the just person happier? Absolutely. The just person is happier. Now, again, the other thing I want to develop based on this answer, right, is the implications in contrast with the Glauconian and Thrasymacheian answers. It's such a surprising result in some ways because for Glaucon and Thrasymachus, and I don't know if you saw me sort of cleverly smuggle this in, the answers of Glaucon and Thrasymachus, in their own way, both assume that goodness is imposed upon the individual from without as either codes of conduct that promote security and flourishing for the many, Glaucon, or codes of conduct imposed from without by the powerful and strongest in society in order to control the behavior of the pawns and the sheeple. But both are assuming, in some sense, that we have no sort of interior capacity for goodness and that we need goodness imposed upon us from without. And what Plato is saying, right, in a reversal of that, is goodness is not primarily a set of rules. It's not primarily a code of conduct, and it's certainly not imposed upon the individual from without. Goodness and justice is cultivated from within through self-understanding. And even if you don't agree with Platonic psychology, which, I would get since it's 2,400-year-old psychology, right? I think some larger points here still stand in some very interesting ways. And that is understanding that you're not simple, that you're complex. 1, know thyself. 2, if you can understand your complexity, you have a better chance at minimizing the conflict, the internal discord that happens due to your own complexity. And 3, that if you were to understand this complexity in enough, then maybe what you could find is a kind of an inner peace in your complexity, maybe even a kind of an inner unity, right? A more complete whole sense of self. Now, I think that that as a definition of goodness is really interesting, right? Because one, it clearly deals with this ancient question of how can we get the most out of existence. But secondly, it also has, once again, as we saw in the earlier lecture on Taoism, some interesting indirect implications for what we recognize or what we more commonly associate with ethics, which is sort of, how does one be a moral person? The question which will become more central in the medieval and modern era. If we were to, through self-understanding, cultivate inner harmony and peace, rather than through self-ignorance have this inner conflict, wouldn't we find that we would be more inclined to be the kind of patient and kind and loving and generous person that we strive to be, as more directly connected to what we think of as the moral norms of behavior? And again, the interesting reversal here still stands. Instead of imagining that what we need to do is kind of impose upon human beings, including ourselves, through that, thou shalt, and you should feel guilty if you don't, the set of norms as rules from without with threat of punishment, imagine that what we need to do, whether it's through the mystical path of the Taoist or whether through it's the Platonic path of wisdom, through an understanding of your own inner complexity. Both of them, by the way, have their own version, right, of know thyself. And if you know yourself, you have a greater chance of cultivating this interior state, right, called justice here in the Platonic philosophy, and maybe enlightened consciousness through Taoist philosophy when you are one with the Tao. In either case, you would be, I would argue, I think, much more obviously more inclined to be the kind of moral person that we say we want to be. And that we get mad with ourselves, right, at times for not being, because we don't live up sometimes to these norms. Well, maybe it's because we're fighting the battle in the wrong location. We're trying to impose something on ourselves from the outside, when in reality, what we need to do is know thyself and learn how to cultivate something from the inside. And with that, I will complete this lecture on the Platonic theory of justice. In the next lecture, I will develop for you the kind of supplement and complement to this teaching that comes out of the very, very famous allegory of the cave. I wish you well. I hope you're safe and sane. I hope that you are knowing thyself and cultivating some sense of inner peace and harmony. And I hope that that's leading towards your ability to be the kind of person that you want to be in the world. Good luck. Thanks.